Chapter 20. Hey, I need you to know the functions of the lymphatic system, many of which you already know. You already know that thanks to the lymphatic system, I'm on slide 2, by the way, we are constantly draining interstitial fluid and therefore are not as likely to suffer from edema, though we'll talk about how that can be facilitated and also not facilitated on another slide. We already know that really same point here. Because the bathtub is always being drained, the lymphatic system allows us to treat hydrostatic pressure of interstitial fluid as about 0 millimeters of mercury. You may already know that especially your lymph nodes and spleen are responsible for filtering debris and potentially pathogens from lymph, and therefore really help to clean the body. You hopefully already know that the spleen, for instance, functions in not just recycling red blood cells that are old and damaged and helping us to reclaim the good stuff that's within red blood cells, like amino acids and iron, but that the spleen, in addition to the liver, helps to store that iron. We've talked about the spleen as the recycling center, but it also helps to store red blood cells, white blood cells, and therefore the spleen has 2 major portions, and we'll come back to this, but we might as well preview. White and red pulp. And the red pulp is the portion that's primarily concerned with the recycling of old/damaged red blood cells. The white pulp is the portion that's responsible for offering housing and storage locale for white blood cells, for leukocytes. The lymphatic system in general, so not just spleen, but also lymph nodes and smaller clusters of lymphoid tissue, such as nodules, offer surveillance locations, kind of like lifeguard stands for our lymphocytes and macrophages, offer locales for our lymphocytes and macrophages to become activated, to sort of realize their destiny, and also to allow housing space for lymphocytes, especially, to proliferate, to give rise to a matchy army. And then the part of the lymphoid or lymphatic function that you're probably not aware of is that, yes, we absorb nutrient monomers across the wall of our small intestine, and most of those nutrient monomers are sent directly into the circulatory system. The exception is lipids. The nutrient monomers that we derive from lipid digestion actually get sent first into the lymphatic system, and only later, as you may recall, near the collarbones, are shared or relayed to the circulatory system. So that's kind of surprising, probably, that the lymphatic system is responsible for absorption, at least directly, of lipids from the small intestine. Okay, I'm moving to slide 3. Slide 3 you actually already have studied. We looked at this very diagram in the blood chapter early on, as a preview, and the image next to it is just zooming way in so that we can drive home the idea that plasma leaks and gives rise to interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid enters the lymphatic system and is instantaneously referred to as lymph. So this is a nice image that really helps to drive that idea home. Moving on to slide 4. This is actually a review. You know most of this. We just talked about interstitial fluid giving rise to lymph, but plasma giving rise to interstitial fluid. We already know that our capillary beds sort of fail to reclaim about 3 liters of interstitial fluid per day, and therefore we're generating about 3 liters of lymph every day. And you hopefully already know that the lymphatic system is a network of vessels and primarily lymph nodes, with lots and lots of other organs and structures sort of helping contribute to all of the lymphatic functions that we went over in slide 2. Anywho, one thing that you might not realize is that the lymphatic system, because lymphatic capillaries are blind-ended, the lymphatic system carries lymph in only one direction. So it's generated at those sort of cul-de-sac-like lymphatic capillaries, and then it's delivered ultimately to those ducts, those lymphatic vessels that are especially large nearest our clavicles. So it's a one-way trip. In other words, lymph does not circulate. It's made anew constantly. Which is one of many contrasts between the lymphatic system and the circulatory system. Okay, I'm now looking at slide 5. Slide 5. Hopefully you realize that circulatory or blood capillaries and lymphatic capillaries are likely in proximity to each other. Otherwise, how are we going to facilitate the uptake of lost fluid? So close proximity, or proximal, you could say. There are a few places where the lymphatic system is missing, but for the most part, it's throughout the body, and you can get a sense of where the lymphatic system is, which is really everywhere, by looking at the partial image on slide 2, as well as the image on slide 9, which I think gets repeated, again on subsequent slides. So really spread out just about everywhere. Very similar to the circulatory system in that sense, very network-like. And one difference between the circulatory system and the lymphatic system is that our circulatory system, especially our capillaries, our circulatory or blood capillaries, they feature intercellular clefts, as you know. And intercellular clefts are certainly helpful in allowing blood capillaries to leak. But believe it or not, lymphatic capillaries are even more leaky. They're even more leaky. And one of the reasons why they're even more leaky is that they're the cells that make up the lymphatic capillary walls, the endothelial cells, they overlap really loosely and therefore create many mini valves. Mini valves are not the same thing as valves. mini valves. Okay, and mini valves are really loose, and they're forced open with greater pressure, hydrostatic pressure, of interstitial fluid. So the more interstitial fluid there is, the more mini valves open. And the less interstitial fluid there is, the less mini valves are forced open. Okay? Now, having really leaky or very permeable lymphatic capillaries is a good thing. We want that interstitial fluid and virtually all of its contents to enter the lymphatic system, but also be aware that mini valves are so permeable that even some whole body pathogens can enter lymphatic capillaries. Cancerous cells can enter if they're small enough, or rather they're clumped into small enough groups, can enter mini valves. So having a lymphatic system is risky in the sense that it offers a freeway that's readily accessible by bad guys. And that's one of the reasons why the lymphatic highway, if you will, is interrupted very, very frequently by lymph nodes. Lymph nodes act as filters, clearing away, checking for, filtering constantly debris and hopefully those bad guys. I'm on slide 6, and I'm looking at the sort of origin or beginning of a lymphatic capillary, where we can really see, okay, here's an endothelial cell, and here's its neighbor. And they overlap, and that overlap is called a mini valve. So in this particular image, we can see 4 mini valves. Very, very loose. I'm on slide 7. You do need to know that lymphatic capillaries that reach into the core of our villi, which are these finger-like projections into the lumen of our small intestine. Villi, each one is a villus. Okay, that at the core of each villus, there's a lymphatic capillary that's primarily responsible for lipid absorption. And because it's specialized for this particular function, it has a special name. It's called a lacteal. Lacteals are lymphatic capillaries, but they're specifically lymphatic capillaries that are serving the absorption of lipids from the small intestine. I'm on slide 8. And this quarter, because we're so crunched for time, I'm not actually going to have you learn sort of the different levels of vessels to the degree that I would typically have my students learn. But I do want you to know that lymphatic vessels feature valves. Valves are much more internal, whereas mini valves are part of the actual wall. And mini valves are a lymphatic capillary only thing, whereas larger lymphatic vessels aren't going to have mini valves, but they will still have valves. Okay, we're going to move to slide 9. The lymphatic ducts, there are 2 of them. These are the largest lymphatic vessels, and these are the ones that dump lymph, now clean, now filtered, back into the circulatory system, so that the circulatory system isn't really ultimately losing fluid. It gets that fluid back. And then the particulars of those ducts, I'm actually going to skip them this quarter, which makes me a little bit sad. Again, just 2 major lymphatic ducts, okay, dumping back into our circulatory system. And actually, the way that I just circled these is a little misleading, so let me undo that. This is the sort of feed back into the circulatory system, the green here, whereas the blue is the circulatory system that's receiving that now cleansed lymph. So don't worry about these labels, okay? Don't worry about these labels for exam 2. However, please be aware that you will need to know veins, including some of those that are shown, and arteries for that matter, for the practicum, per the practicum study guide. Anywho, I'm on slide 11. The lymphatic system doesn't have a pump. Right? It doesn't have the dedicated pump that we see in the circulatory system, a heart. And so it's going to rely on, neighbors and friends. It's going to rely on muscular pumping of skeletal muscle. It's going to rely on muscular pumping of smooth muscle in adjacent arteries. Thank goodness we have the mechanism of valves in our lymphatic vessels to prevent lymph from flowing backward. We also rely on the respiratory pump, or skeletal, smooth, and respiratory milking, to help move lymph along. And then there is also some smooth muscle in the walls of our lymphatic vessels. Not so much our lymphatic capillaries, but our larger lymphatic vessels, and that also helps lymph to move along. But if a patient is ever immobile for any length of time, there's always a risk for these mechanisms really not being able to fight gravity, and there's always a risk of edema or swelling. So that makes it really, really clear that physical activity is so important, in part because of the skeletal muscle pump, to get lymph to move along. Speaking of move along, I'm on slide 12. Hey, don't worry about these labels. No freaking out, okay? Hopefully you already realize, because we talked about functions, that lymphoid tissue, especially the lymphoid tissue we see in lymph nodes, in lymph nodules, in the spleen, in some of the other regions where we can find lymphoid tissue, is providing housing, surveillance sites, maturation sites, proliferation sites for lymphocytes and macrophages. And in terms of what lymphoid tissue looks like, I just want you to know what kind of tissue. Because chances are you learned loose reticular connective tissue well enough in 241 to already recognize that it's got oodles and oodles of nooks and crannies, that it looks sort of like an English muffin. And all of those nooks and crannies are what provides storage space and surveillance space and space for proliferation, where lymphocytes and macrophages are concerned. Okay, so loose reticular connective tissue, and just in case. Okay, moving on to slide 13. I'm a little bit worried because my husband just walked in the house, so he might interrupt us, so I'm going to just interrupt to begin with. Sorry for the interruption. I'm on slide 13, and again, because this quarter is so, well, such a mess, we're gonna not worry about these structural categories, at least not in a formal way. But please realize that some lymphoid tissue is clumped together and therefore makes conspicuous organs. They might be small, but they're conspicuous organs. Whereas some lymphoid tissue is more sheet-like and more so infused and less clumped together, and therefore not as conspicuous. And one of the reasons why we see that is because a lot of our lymphoid tissue is sheet-like and inconspicuous and imbued into our mucosae. And that's actually what MALT stands for. MALT. Mucosae-associated lymphoid tissue. Okay, a lot of this is very sheet-like and inconspicuous. Sometimes MALT is clustered, and when it is clustered, it helps to make up little clumps in, say, our appendix and our Peyer's patches. And I'm going to move to the next slide, slide 14. Peyer's patches are little clumps or nodules of lymphoid tissue that are housed just within the distal portion of our small intestine. Okay, and then we also have sort of clumped lymphoid tissue in our appendix. All right, and then some of the other things that we're looking at in this image, we'll actually use a different slide to point out. So here we go, slide 15. Now, if there's really only one thing that you learn from this chapter, this is probably it. This slide 15 and slide 16 are probably most important, because we're going to need to recognize the phrase primary and secondary lymphoid organs in the immune chapter. So if we don't master these terms in the lymphatic chapter, we're going to be boy, I wonder what word I was trying to make. We're going to be pooched for a subsequent chapter, and nobody likes that. So we need to know that the primary lymphoid organs are specifically the thymus and red bone marrow. And what makes a lymphoid organ primary is that this is where B cells and T cells mature. This isn't necessarily where they become activated. In fact, we hope it isn't where they become activated. And activated and maturity are not the same thing, which we'll come back to in the immunity chapter. But maturity means old enough to do their job, whereas activation means hired. Okay, so just because you, graduate from high school, you're mature enough to get a job, but that doesn't guarantee that you'll get hired. Anyway, we'll come back to that. And then secondary lymphoid organs include lymph nodes, the spleen, the tonsils, which are yet another example of sort of clumped lymphoid tissue, Peyer's patches, the appendix, and then just in general, MALT, mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Okay, and what makes a lymphoid organ a secondary lymphoid organ is that this is where lymphocytes don't mature, rather they get hired here and they get activated, become activated. Okay. And then if you're very visual like me, slide 16 will actually help you probably more so to not just figure out who are the primary lymphoid organs, who are the secondary lymphoid organs, but also visualize where they are in the body, which could be important for exam 2, could also be important for the practicum. Okay, so red bone marrow and thymus are primary lymphoid organs. Okay, tonsils are secondary. Lymph nodes, which aren't shown here, but we have seen them in different images in this lecture, are secondary. Spleen is secondary. Peyer's patches, secondary. And appendix, secondary. Okay, so that means that red bone marrow and thymus, this is where lymphocytes, B cells and T cells go to mature, whereas lymph nodes, tonsils, spleen, Peyer's patches, MALT, for that matter. We should add that to our list, by the way. The appendix, this is where lymphocytes go to become activated. Okay? Okay, lymph nodes. We have hundreds spread out throughout our bodies, and the number varies. In fact, estimates vary. I've heard as low as 300. I've heard as high as 700. Maybe a rough average would be 500-ish. But you have hundreds of lymph nodes. And they are your chief secondary lymphoid organs. So more often than not, if a lymphocyte is becoming activated, it's in a lymph node. And how does it become activated? By meeting its matchy-matchy antigen. Okay, that's what activation means. Meeting its matchy-matchy antigen. Most of your lymph nodes are fairly deep within your body, and so you're not likely to feel their shape. You're not likely to note when they're swollen, but you do have 6 of those hundreds of lymph nodes that over the course of your lifetime, you're likely to become aware of. You have 2 in your neck that are especially superficial. Those are called cervical. You have 2 in your armpits, 1 per armpit, that are especially superficial. Okay? You have more than 2 in your neck. You have more than 2 in your armpit. I'm saying you have 2 that are especially superficial in your neck, 2 that are especially superficial in your armpits, and then 2 that are especially superficial in the groin. And those that are in the armpits are called axillary. Those that are in the groin, inguinal. Okay. Now all we're saying is that it's these 6 that are especially superficial. And that means that when you have a respiratory infection or a sinus infection, because these guys are nearest your sore throat, your stuffy nose, your angry cranial sinuses. These guys, if they're very close to the surface, and they're likely to swell, and you're likely to actually feel them. If you have an infection in an arm or an infection in your upper torso, these guys, axillary, are especially superficial. You're especially likely to feel when they're swollen and tender. If you have an infection in your groin, an infection in the leg, in the hip, these guys are especially likely to be notable just because they're so superficial. Their swelling is likely to be something that you detect. But please do not conclude that you have only 6 lymph nodes. That is ridiculous. Moving on. 18. We've actually already established that lymph nodes act as filters. They're removing debris. They're removing potential pathogens, okay, and therefore cleaning lymph, which is kind of like cleaning blood. However, realize that the lymphatic system picks up interstitial fluid along almost its entire length. So it's not like it's only working on fluid that it gleaned distally. Okay. Moving on to 19, your lymph nodes are somewhat bean-shaped. They have a fibrous capsule, as so many of your ovoid organs do. Okay. And they have lots of sinuses. However, this quarter, we're going to really dumb this down just because the quarter's nutty, not because I think you're dumb. I think you're brilliant. I want you to know, I'm on 20 now. I want you to know that each lymph node has a cortex. Each lymph node has a medulla. Okay? I want you to know that the cortex has lots of follicles. Here's a follicle. Here's a follicle. Here's a follicle. And these follicles act as germinal centers. And whenever we see a germinal center, whether it's in a lymph node or not, this is an area where B cells in particular are proliferating like mad. So we make B cell armies in the cortex of our lymph nodes. Okay? But also in our cortex, we will see T cells going about their roaming business. They roam. Okay. In the medulla, we can find B cells and T cells, and we'll find out later that a plasma cell is just a further differentiated lymphocyte. But the take-home message is, what am I expecting to find in a lymph node? Well, B cells, T cells, macrophages, and possibly bad guys. Okay. Follicle, that's what I care about. This layer cortex, that's what I care about. This core medulla, that's what I care about. I want you to know that there's a fibrous capsule, but we're not going to bother with these partitions here that are called trabeculae. They're just like invaginations of fibrous capsule, but we're not going to bother with those this quarter. We're also not going to bother with medullary cord. Heart is breaking a little bit, but oh well. We're also not going to bother to learn the different sinuses, what they're called, where they are in the lymphatic, or in the lymph node rather, this quarter, and that means that we're gonna really dumb this list down. We're gonna really simplify that list in just a hot second. What I want you to know is that because your lymph node, I'm on 22, by the way. I don't know if I told you that I'd moved on. What a jerk. If a lymph node is bean shaped, okay, that means that it has a concave side here and a convex side here, okay? And often when an organ, whether it's a lymph node or otherwise, has this bean shape, a concave side and a convex side, the concave side, I'm making a mess here, so let me clean this up a little bit. The concave side will act as a hilum, and sort of be like a foyer or an entryway or an exitway, mud room, if you will, for circulatory vessels, and in this case, lymphatic vessels as well. Okay, so it's kind of like an access point. All right. And where lymph nodes are concerned, we're going to move on to slide 23, by the way. Lymph is always entering on that convex surface, and it's always exiting from that concave surface. Hilum. Here, hilum. Okay. And notice that there are fewer vessels leaving the lymph node than there are vessels entering the lymph node. Slide 23. Okay, what does this mean? Well, it means that lymph that's arriving on the convex side of the lymph node is forced to slow down as it's moving through the lymph node. It's forced to slow down because there are fewer vessels on the concave side. There are fewer ways to get out. Okay? And if lymph is forced to slow down on its way through a lymph node, then leukocytes, macrophages, and lymphocytes have more time to practice their function of surveillance. Okay? So here's the gist. Lymphatic vessels arriving to our convex side, afferent lymphatic vessels. We're not going to worry about sinuses this quarter. Okay? But these guys, they're sending lymph into cortex through medulla and ultimately out. Ooh, I actually erased a little too much there. Let's back up a smidgy, I hope. There we go. Getting rid of sinuses. Okay. Cortex. Medulla. And then out through efferent lymphatic vessels at the hilum, meaning the concave side, whereas these guys are convex side. Okay, that's the order I need you to know, and really why, right? Okay, so 24. The only things we're going to worry about again: fibrous capsule. Okay, and then these guys, follicles. Where are follicles? Cortex. And then I'm not seeing any follicles here. Why? Because this is medulla. That's it. Histologically, that's all I'm going to worry about this quarter. Okay, I'm on 25. Your spleen is on your left side. If you do not know that by the time the quarter ends, then you really should not graduate 242. And it's very, very high in the abdomen. In fact, it is touching the diaphragm. It's spelled diaphragm. Okay. It too is bean shaped, so it has its own hilum as well. It too has a fibrous capsule. Okay. But what I want you to know, actually you already know. You already know that the spleen features white pulp and red pulp. I'm moving to 25. There's that diaphragm in contact with the spleen. Our spleen is kind of rock or bean shaped, but please know that the pig has a really elongate, almost worm shaped spleen. One of the few differences between the fetal pig and the human body. Okay, so here's the spleen, hugged by diaphragm, very, very left, even further left than your stomach. Okay. Okay, I'm on 27. The spleen acts as lymphoid tissue, and so it offers leukocytes surveillance positions, room to mature, room to proliferate. It acts as recycling plant. We already know that. For not just old and or damaged red blood cells, but also for platelets, old and or damaged platelets. Excuse me. We already know that the spleen stores iron, for instance, with the aid of the liver. We maybe did not know before that your spleen stores excess platelets that are healthy, stores kind of a backstock of monocytes, just to kind of keep us ready for when they might be needed. And it's thought that spleen and liver may be the site for erythropoiesis, or maybe a site for erythropoiesis in a fetus. So the red bone marrow may be sort of supplemented by efforts of the spleen and the liver. That's a maybe. Okay, I'm not going to worry about histology. I'm on slide 28. I just need you to know that the spleen has red pulp and white pulp. I don't really care whether or not you can find them, because frankly, one is red and one is white. Okay, but you should know that the red pulp is responsible for sort of the recycling function that the spleen provides, and the white pulp is more of an immune area, so it's going to offer those surveillance points, and in that sense sort of act like a lymph node, and it's also going to act as a storage site for instance, monocytes. Okay, moving on, I'm on 29. MALT, we already talked about MALT. MALT can be thin and inconspicuous and sheet-like throughout our mucous membranes, but sometimes it's clumped, and when it's clumped, it helps make up our tonsils. You have 4 tonsils. Our Peyer's patches, nobody wants to count how many Peyer's patches you have, and your appendix, you have 1 appendix. Okay, tonsils, 4 tonsils, and in this image you can't really tell that you have 4. You can only see the 3 sort of flavors of tonsils. This tonsil is a loner, it's a singleton, okay, and it's called your pharyngeal tonsil. This tonsil is paired, so you have right and left palatine tonsils, okay, and this tonsil is a singleton, is not paired. It's called your lingual tonsil, okay? And tonsils are small clumps of lymphoid tissue, and they do have germinal centers. They do offer small surveillance sites for lymphocytes, okay? I'm on 31, and I'm not learning too much. Whereas on 32, you can better see, oh yeah, there's 1 pharyngeal tonsil, there's 1 lingual tonsil, but there's a left and a right palatine tonsil, okay? And then other clumps of MALT, of lymphoid tissue, Peyer's patches, again, distal small intestine, that's these guys. No, you do not have exactly 4. And then the appendix, there's just 1, okay? The appendix is a little dingle-dangle, a little sac almost, that's sort of hanging off the very, very, very first portion of the large intestine, just after the small intestine dumps into large intestine. That's where you can find the appendix. But we'll get more specific when we get to the digestive system. So more later, okay? Both Peyer's patches and the appendix, because of where they're located, they help prevent bacteria, which is helpful or may be helpful in our gut from infiltrating deeper within our body, from breaching the wall of the intestine, okay? And I'm moving on. I'm on 33. The thymus we actually already studied a bit. We already know that this is where T cells in particular mature. So not only a primary lymphoid organ, but specifically primary for T cells. Okay, we already know that the thymus atrophies as we age. It becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And then I'm not going to worry about these particulars this quarter. I think we've already seen the image on 34 in the past, right large conspicuous thymus in a newborn. Where the hell is it in an adult? Okay, and then slide 35 is one of the more important slides in this lecture. Please, please, please do yourself a favor and complete the table, and then clear it out. Take everything off of it and make it again, and then clear it out and make it again. Okay, so table, very important. Otherwise, why did I bother to make it?